today to put ice in.
Put ice in it to cool them off.
Did they get in?
Yeah.
Yeah, I went over there today, and one of them was just standing there, doing their feet.
I stood behind her when they wanted to.
They're worse than dogs and cats, you know.
Oh, and that was the worst thing is after she made it, she had a salty food that run through the line. Well, then we turned around, it's rolling in there.
Oh,
Right.
Oh, she'd take it in and give it a bath. Oh, it's stunk.
All right, good afternoon.
David?
Or evening, yep, after 5 o'clock. We're going to get started. We'll open up with prayer. Father, we come before you. We give you thanks for the ability to come together to learn about your word in a way that's unique. And I pray that it builds us up and helps us to understand your character and to encourage us in our walk even more. We love you. We bless you. We give you thanks. Amen. So I really like to be down there for Tuesday nights, but I guess Brother David, he's been gone, so they took away the mic. I don't know where it's at. So we're up here tonight. I'll be back down there next week, but we'll open tonight. I hope you read. I know last week y'all asked chapters 1 and 2 in the book. It was about 20 pages, so it shouldn't have been too much. So we'll just ask a couple questions for discussion here before we get started. And I'm going to go to chapter 1, and we'll just ask one question from there and one question from chapter 2. And I'm picking randomly because I hadn't looked to see what it is. We'll say, what are some of the main materials used in ancient times for writing? Which of these materials was the most important for the Old Testament? Most important for the Old Testament.
What are some of them, main materials?
Papyrus was one.
Yeah.
Stone and clay,
Stone and clay.
wood, metal, leather.
Yep.
What about codex?
Codex. Well, codex is a type of the way it's put together, but a codex would have been made from papyrus, and so those are pretty good. Those are all good. I think leather, animal skin would be the most important for the Old Testament, most durable, and it would last a little longer. Let's see. The Bible makes reference to a number of writing materials. Check back over these references. Well, now, I said I was going to read one. Let me go to chapter 2 here. Here we go. Who is mentioned in the Bible as being the first author of anything? What evidence is available to show that he is the author of the Pentateuch? Moses. There you go. So when it asks who is mentioned in the Bible as the first author of anything, what's that question referring to? You remember?
Say the question again.
It says, who is mentioned in the Bible as being the first author of anything? How is that mentioned in the Bible? How do we know that he's the first author of anything? Moses.
Did God say write it down?
Yeah, there are times where, so there's times where God said, I want you to write this down. The one example I always go back to is Amalek. Whenever the Israelites have the issue with Amalek and all that incident happens, God says, all right, I want you to write this incident down right now. We know that Moses wrote down the fullness of the writings later on, but in that moment, we see that God told him to write this down right now. So we can try to do one more. Let's see. Let's get back. I lost my place here. That was a good question. Let's see. Describe the arrangement of the Old Testament books in the English Bible and how this compares to the Hebrew Bible. You remember that discussion or in your book reading? The English arrangement of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible versus the Hebrew version.
Don't we have history where it says Joshua Judges?
Yeah, No, that's right, yeah. So, English Bible, we kind of have the Torah historical writings. So we call Joshua through Kings, really, the historical writings. This is the history of Israel. And then we'll go into our wisdom literature and then our prophets. We'll really kind of have 5 divisions in the English version of the New Old Testament, Whereas the Hebrew Bible just has 3. What we call historical books, they actually call prophetic books. Those are the early prophetic writings. Joshua, Judges, King, Samuel, all that stuff. So good job. All right, so just to kind of bring us where we were from last week, we finished up the background to the Old Testament, just kind of given the background of all the things we talked about tonight, the divisions of it, or what came from those questions anyway. The divisions of the Old Testament, we talked about who wrote it, how we know certain authors wrote certain things. Do we know, for example, that Jeremiah wrote the book of Jeremiah? I had lunch today with a friend he has a really excellent background, educational background in biblical studies. He got his master's from Yale's Bible School, Yale's Theological Seminary, and went to Canada, got his doctorate. And we were talking about this very thing. I said I kind of got into a discussion, not a heated discussion, but a good, lively discussion with one of my professors one time over the book of Jeremiah. He is insistent that Jeremiah wrote the book of Jeremiah. And I said, it doesn't say that. It says these are the words of Jeremiah. So understanding how the books were written, did Jeremiah write down his own words, or did someone else write down the words that Jeremiah spoke? That's the question. Either way, they're both inspired, no matter how you look at it. Some people would view a scribe writing down someone else's words as being less inspired. That's our God isn't saying he can only inspire certain people. They're just as inspired no matter who wrote them down. And so we had a discussion about that last week. Answering the three questions: who wrote it, when was it written, and why was it written? Those three questions, very important to understand the background of our Bibles, each book, and all of that. So those three questions are very important. We should be answering or asking those questions and seeking to answer them every time we come to a different book. We started last week the transmission of the Old Testament. So we talked about the background. Now we're going to talk about how we got it, how it was written down, how it found its way through the ancient world all the way to our Bibles today. And that's kind of our journey of where we're at. We're going to do this with the Old Testament, and then we'll do it with the New Testament, and then we'll kind of bring them all together at the end and talk about modern English translations. We'll go from the very first English translation, which is the Tyndale translation, all the way to what we have today. We have translations that are being released even now within the past couple of years. Last year, Legacy LSB, Legacy Standard Bible. I can't remember. That was the most recent one. So we'll talk about all those after we bring them all together. But we started with the transmission of the Old Testament, talking about Moses and how it was written, and we talked about what a manuscript was. So a manuscript is a handwritten copy of something that's written by hand. And we talked about autographs. So the originals, the very first thing that would have been written down, that's called an autograph. We have none, right? There's no autographs of any biblical text. We just have manuscripts, handwritten copies. We talked about why we don't have those autographs, especially when it comes to the Old Testament, the decay and the age and the destruction, and why those things would have been destroyed long before. If we would have had the original autographs, when we know how the old scrolls were written and how they were the material used, that would have meant that nobody read them, and so that would have been counterproductive to the whole point of them being written in the first place. So tonight we're going to talk about the Old Testament prior to 100 CE, and then we're really just going through time. And what I mean by the Old Testament prior to 100 CE, 100 of the prior to 100 of the Common Era, or AD, before 100 AD. If we use, there's two ways to reference that. More modernly, we say CE, but that's also AD. So what do we have when we look at the copies that we have from the Old Testament prior to 100 AD? So we're talking about 70 years after the death of Jesus. Up until recently, we really haven't known much, right? We had what's called the Masoretic text, and we'll get into that. We'll get into that later, what the Masoretic text is. But that was our Hebrew. That was the oldest Hebrew manuscripts we had. That was from the 9th century. So you're talking about 800 years after Jesus. That was the oldest Hebrew text we had of any Bible. So going back even further, until recently, we really didn't have much when it came to the Old Testament prior to 100 CE. And we really don't have much more today. We had back, for a long time, we've had the Samaritan Pentateuch. So Everybody knows what the Samaritans are. At least if you've read the New Testament, we have Jesus goes to the Samaritan woman. This is a region in North Israel, north of Judea, where you kind of had, going back to the history of Israel, you had this mixture where the Assyrians came in. They brought a lot of Israelites out of Israel into captivity. Those people didn't come back, but you still had a lot of people stay. And when you talk about the war that happens in the ancient world, what did they always take to themselves as kind of a prize of war? The women and the children. And so you had this intermingling of Assyrians and northern Israelites, and that became the Samaritans. These people, and they were viewed in the first century. We see the disciples questioning Jesus, why would you talk to this woman? Well, they were considered half-breeds. They were considered as if they were less because they weren't pure Jewish people. But they had a Pentateuch. They had a Torah to themselves, but that Torah is slightly different than ours. Why is that? We're talking about the northern tribes. Remember, they went north and they had their own altars. They had their own place to worship. They didn't go to Jerusalem to worship. So their Pentateuch has in it that the worship was to be there. So you have some differences, but by and large, you actually have very much the same text as what we find in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible for us. There's very little differences, and we actually use the Samaritan Pentateuch in our translational studies. You're talking about translators who study the text and try to say, what does this text mean? What did it originally say? We bring the Samaritan Pentateuch sometimes into it to say, this helps us understand the passage better. We have the Septuagint. There's 2 ways of saying it. What's the right way, Septuagint or Septuagint? As my professor said, whatever way your professor says it, that's the right way. Fall in line with what your class says. So we have the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Old Testament that started in the 3rd century BCE or BC, before Christ. And then you had this other one called the Nash Papyrus. Those 3 were really the only 3 that we had when it came to the Old Testament before 100 CE or AD. And then we had the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody's heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Back in the 1940s, Israel becomes a nation, and this child finds these caves and all of these canisters or pottery that had these scrolls in them that were saving them, or they were tucked away in the caves. These Dead Sea Scrolls are dated between 250 BCE and 50 of the Common Era, 50 AD. So you're still covering about 300 years that these were written. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't just have the biblical text, they have other writings too. Some writings that the Essenes were writing. We have the War Scroll. We have I'm trying to think of the other ones. There's I can't remember, but there's other texts that are written along with the biblical text. The very thing that matters the most for us is understanding that when compared to the Mazaritic text, that oldest text that we had from the 9th century, it's almost identical. There's no real changes that are happening between the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were written and when the Mazarites were putting their text together as well. You have the scroll of Isaiah, the most intact scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's virtually the same. It's very identical, and it's really honing in on this meticulous nature of the scribes and how they would meticulously write down and copy. And we're going to talk about that tonight, and how they copied these texts so intentionally. When we look at the earliest language of the earliest text, the oldest thing we have is the Septuagint. The oldest thing we have is the Greek translation. So when we look at the Hebrew script of our old Hebrew Old Testaments, what do we have? We have the what we call the Bloch Script. What we know as Hebrew, I should have had an example of it, but I don't even have it up there. But what we know as Hebrew, right? What y'all look at in Hebrew class, that's the Bloch Script. That's actually a later script of Hebrew. What we have before that is Paleo Hebrew. Paleo Hebrew is looks more like chicken scratch. It's not really legible. It doesn't, to me, it's harder to read than the Bloch Script. It doesn't really relate to each other. And then it's questionable before that even what happens before Paleo Hebrew, whether there even was anything other than that before it. What we don't have is any Hebrew text. We don't have the autographs. We don't even have anything that comes close to the time frame of the autographs that show us what the Old Testament was written in, right? Because the oldest thing we have is a Greek translation. Was it Paleo? Was it Proto-Semitic? That's the word used for we see the word pictures. Was it Proto-Semitic? Was it Paleo? We don't know because we don't have any indication of that at all. We talked about the amulet last week. The oldest inscription that we have of any biblical text is from the amulets that have the numbers 6 on it, right? It's not the full number 6. It's it just says, "The Lord bless you, Yahweh bless you and keep you," written on an amulet. And that's written in Paleo Hebrew. So the Paleo Hebrew that we have, the oldest Hebrew that we have of the biblical text, goes back to, I think it was, 7th century or 8th century BCE. And it uses Paleo Hebrew at that time. But we know that our Bibles were started before that. So we just don't know exactly how it was written down. And it's not that important to understand how the letters were written down in the first place. It's the message. Has the message been transmitted to us accurately? And we see that it by and large has. What did word divisions look like? So our scrolls today, the more modern Hebrew scrolls, they actually divide the words. They put spaces in between the words. It makes it easier to read. We've seen the Hebrew text where you have a word and a space. But actually the most ancient scrolls had no spaces. And I use this example, so people I see y'all writing down on paper, I want you to write down these letters. Just write them down with no spaces. Godisnowhere. Godisnowhere. With no spaces. Now this would be a sentence. I'm using something in English that to highlight this challenge that we have in the ancient text, because this is an English exercise to show you what we deal with. Now, if you were to take that sentence, how would you divide it and what would it mean? If you were going to take that sentence of English letters, what would it say? Anybody?
I think it says God is now here,
God is now here. It could say that, yeah.
or God is nowhere.
Or God is nowhere. That's exactly right. So the thing that is so challenging about the ancient text is trying to see, and this is both in the Hebrew and the Greek. Greek manuscripts, the earliest Greek manuscripts, they also have no spaces. They have no punctuation. They don't tell you when one sentence starts and one begins. And so this is a challenge. Does that set of letters that you wrote down, does that mean God is now here or God is nowhere? And the implication is drastic. They almost mean opposite things, right? I'll give you an example. That one of my favorite examples from the Old Testament is Amos 6:12. I don't know if y'all have your Bibles. Amos 6:12, and I'll pull open what I have, and we'll just look at a couple things, a couple of translations, and see what they say. I should have had mine open and ready. When you get there, just holler at me. That's right. Amos 6:12. All right. Who has their spot? You got one? What's yours say? And what translation are you using?
I figured he was loud.
Oh, no, that's all right. Go ahead.
I got the King James version.
King James, that's great. That's a good one to start with.
Ready?
Yep.
Shall horses run upon the rock? Will one plow there with oxen? For ye have turned judgment into gall, and the fruit of righteousness into hemlock.
So we're going to focus on the first two lines. Do horses run on rocks? Is that what it said?
Yep.
And do oxes, what does it say? Do oxes plow there with them?
Will one plow there with an oxen?
Will one plow there with an oxen? So this...
One there looks like it's been added.
It's in italics. That's right. It's been added there. Now, here's the situation we have with this verse. I love using this as an example. Some of the translations will say, "Do horses run on the rocky crags? Do oxen plow?" Or excuse me, does one plow with oxen? Now, what's going on with this Hebrew poetry is that it's a doublet, right? It's two lines next to each other that mean the same thing. We see this all through Scripture. It'll say one thing, it'll say another, but it's saying the same thing. The problem we have here is, what's the answer to "do horses run on rocky crags"? Can a horse run on a rocky crag? We're talking about the juttings of a sea. When you go to a sea and you see all these rocks, a goat could, but could a horse? The answer is no. Yes?
See, mine says cliff.
A cliff.
Horses run on the cliff. Will one plow there with oxen? You wouldn't want to be next to that.
You wouldn't want to be, yeah. So the answer is no. What version is that?
That's the Messianic Jewish family.
Messianic Jewish Family Bible. That's I haven't heard that translation to use cliff. It's really speaking to a rocky crag, but the answer is the same. Does a horse run along a cliff? A horse doesn't want to run along a cliff because, and really what it should give you the picture of is a horse running on the side of a cliff. Like goats can do that. You see goats that are on these cliffs, you're like, how do they even stand up there? But a horse could never do that. But the problem is with this first translation I'm using, does one plow with oxen? Well, actually the answer to that is yes. A person does plow with oxen. And so what we have is a Hebrew word here. It's I'm not going to ask you to write it out or spell it, but you have Baba Kareem. Baba Kareem. And so if we use the word Baba Kareem, or if we split it up, because some older manuscripts, they actually split it up to say Baba Kar Yam. Baba Kar Yam, two words. Yam means sea. And so you would have a question where it would say, does one plow the sea with oxen? And so it's the question of, is it talking about, does one plow the sea with oxen? Or does one plow there with oxen? And so a lot of them add italics to there to say, oxen can't plow on a rocky crag. But I really like the Baba Kar Yam, which is overemphasizing, it's bringing this... because usually in a Hebrew doublet, it's not going to use the same thing twice, like a rocky crag twice. And so one cannot take oxen out to sea and plow the ground. But that comes from whether the words are together as one word, or do we separate them out. It's very plausible both ways. But one thing it doesn't say, does one plow with oxen? So if we leave it all together as one word, that's what it means. Does one plow with oxen? The answer is yes, but the reason they add italics is because they're trying to answer the question in a no. And when we add there, the question would be, does one plow with oxen on the rocky crags or on the cliff? And the answer is no. That's why translators are adding that extra there that's not even there in the Hebrew. But if we look at the split of the word, it could mean, does one plow the sea with oxen? Does that make sense? The struggle that we're dealing with in translations, especially translating the oldest text, is there's no divisions, there's no punctuation, there's no separation to tell us exactly what it says. And so when we look at the history of the Bible, hopefully we walk away being a lot more lenient in how we view translations and translators, because they have a hard task. It's a really, really hard task. Even the most well-knowledgeable people in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, they still have these challenges of trying to say, what is this really saying? When we go beyond, we're still at prior to 100 CE, we have something called the Sopherim, S-O-F-E-R-I-M. This is a group of people, they were the early scholars. They were called Sopherim because they used to count all the letters of the Torah. And I think, let me look and see, I think we'll get to it. So I don't necessarily want to go into it just yet. Let me see. What happened here and what they were doing to be, here we go. And I will share this with y'all, and if you're watching online, I can share my slides with you. I'll share this with y'all. What they would do is they would actually, at the end of, I use Deuteronomy as an example. At the end of Deuteronomy, they would actually have, at the end of the manuscript or the end of the scroll, they would actually go and calculate how many verses, how many lines, how many letters, and what they're doing is they would transmit the text. They're copying the text all the way through. And you think about a person who's gone through this task. Now, whether they've slaughtered the animal or not, or someone else did, someone has slaughtered an animal. They've skinned it. They've stretched the skin. They've tanned it. They've prepared it. They've taken it and laid it all out. For Deuteronomy, you're talking about 25 feet of animal skin laid out, sewn together. Now they've gone through and meticulously lined it. If you ever look at like our Torah scroll, you'll see it has lines. They go through and just meticulously line it so that they're all writing on the same line. And then they go through the work of transmitting the text. They go from one text over here, they're copying, and then they go over here and they write it down. And they'll do this for the whole scroll and say they get it all together for the whole scroll. In the book of Deuteronomy, they have 955 verses, right? Now imagine you're that scribe and you get to the end and you count 942. Man. And you just spent a lot of time transmit. Now you scrap the whole scroll and start all over. That's how meticulous they were. They were these Sopharim. They're from 500 BCE to 100 CE, so they cover about 600 years. And their method of transmitting the text was really going from here, looking at a text here, and they're going over here, looking at a text and going back. There's a lot of human error that can happen from here to here. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to think. I have a friend. I'm actually writing and copying out the Bible myself, but someone told me recently they were doing the same. Who was it? Jerry Aldet. Thank you. Jerry Aldet is doing the same thing. He's taking the Bible and he's writing it out for himself. It's a very, very beneficial task if you ever feel inclined to do so. It forces you to slow down. It forces you to meditate on each word, and And what he said was, I couldn't believe how many times I mess up. And he's looking at not a scroll over here and a scroll over here. He's looking at a book page here and a book page here, and the amount of error just between there. There's human error. So we have those type of errors come up, and when we talk about discrepancies, some people who are critics of the Bible, they would say, well, there's so many errors in manuscripts, and we'll talk about that later, but really a lot of your errors in manuscripts have to do with small errors of, you put two A's instead of one A, or you wrote T-O-O in English instead of T-O. It can change the meaning, but you can clearly see that it was a scribal error. So those are the things that are happening, but these Sopharim, that's how they're copying the text, and they're counting at the end. Now, they would actually have a running tally. When they started in Genesis, they have how many verses are there. When they go to Exodus, they would count Exodus, and then they would actually tally up both combined. And so they're keeping a tally as they go through the whole Old Testament to see, are the books accurately transcribed? Are the collection of books, are we coming up with the same math? That's how they would do it. And they came to a place of where they started dictating this, right? So if I'm looking back and forth, there's error. But now if I say, now you all get some scrolls, and I'm going to read to you, and you write down what I read. It's a little more accurate, but there's still room for error. But it's a little more accurate. No longer am I trying to remember what I see from here to here. You're focused on what you're writing, and I'm saying, the Lord, and y'all write down, the Lord is good and compassionate. And so there's less error. You actually have in this period, you're going from writing down, looking back and forth, to actually having it dictated out, and people are writing it down. So you end up with a little bit better. When you look at the text prior to 100 CE, you don't have the vowel pointings that we see in our text today. The vowel pointings that are so beneficial to us in learning Hebrew, they're not there in the older texts. The Hebrew, it's called A-B-J-A-D or A-B-Y-A-D, Abyad. That's the Hebrew text without vowels. That's what it's referred to. Whenever we had during the monarchy, the times of the kings of Israel, you had the Hey, the Yod, and the Vav. being used as vowels at that point. What we understand for Hebrew is that it actually changed a little bit, just like English. You try to understand the English of 1000 AD, right? The Middle Ages are true Shakespearean English. It's pretty hard, right? I mean, it's really hard. When we'll look at later on Wycliffe's translation or Tyndale's translation. Tyndale's translation is almost incomprehensible for us today. The English is so old. Hebrew does the same thing, and we're talking about Tyndale's translation in the 13th or 14th century to now. You're like 600 years. Think about the Hebrew from the time of Moses to our text that we have, the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Masoretic text. You're talking 1,000 years, 1,500 years. How much it would change then as well. So we know that during the monarchy we had this hey, yod, and vav, which were somewhat consonants before that. Now they kind of transform into vowels a little bit. They're not being pointed like we use vowels, but if you study Hebrew, you know that the hey a lot of times is like in our English, the AH at the end of a word. It's like ah, which is really a vowel. The H has no sound, right? Does that make sense? The H has no sound at the end of, like, I'm trying to think, Isaiah. Isaiah would have a hey at the end, but it doesn't make a sound. It's actually being used as somewhat of a vowel before there was vowel pointing. So we see that some of that other's kind of technical. I don't want to go into that, but that's what we have prior to 100 BCE, and, 100 CE of the Common Era. From there, we move to, from that point forward, 100 CE to 100 or 500 CE, so 100 AD to 500 AD. And this is a time period where we really have a standardization of the text. They're becoming very much more meticulous about how they're writing down the text. We have from Qumran to Masada and Bar Kokhba, we have these military, I don't know what that was. We have these military events going on. The Romans are trying to dispel all the Jews out of Israel. So Masada, which is one of my favorite places in Israel, is this hilltop fortress. Masada was actually built by Herod. Everybody knows who Herod the Great was. It was built by Herod. It was one of his palaces. He didn't really live there. He would use it as a place where if dignitaries came from other countries, he would put them up there. It had a beautiful view over the Dead Sea, and it was really high up, and it was really beautiful. But he never really lived there. He would use it for that. Well, when the Jews were being run out, you had these militant Jews, these people who wanted to fight back. They actually took Masada, this fortress that was built to be protective for anyone who was staying there. They took it, and it was this long battle to where the Romans came in. They had to build. They brought in tons of dirt. You can see it there today to build this ramp to where they could get up and finally. And what you have in the story is the Jews all committed suicide before they could be killed by the Romans. But you have that going on. You have the Bar Kokhba revolts, which came a little bit later, where they're fighting against the Romans. But what all does this mean to our text? Why are these historical events important? You went from having scrolls kind of in every community, every synagogue. They're being used, and as they become deteriorated, you destroy them properly. It's kind of how we do our American flags today, right? If a flag becomes tattered, there's a ceremony. They would do the same thing because it's the Word of God. You didn't just toss it out. You would actually go through the process of destroying it properly so that it wouldn't be misused. But then when the Romans are coming in, they're actually threatening the existence of Israel. They're threatening the existence of the writings of Israel. So now you have this concerted effort to preserve, to make sure that we hold tight and that things are stored up. And this is what we talked about earlier with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have these other writings that are being written down. You also have the Tanaim. So Tanaim, Tannaim, from 20 to 200 AD. This word Tanaim is talking about those who hand down orally, or those who teach orally or study openly. These were basically like a sect of scribes who were like the best teachers. But they're teaching how to live out the Bible. You know, the Bible gives you instructions They're telling how to live it out. This is what you may have understood in some of your studies as the oral Torah or the oral traditions, right? These were called oral because they weren't written down. And they weren't written down because over time it may change on how they applied it, but also it wasn't as important as the Torah. For them, the oral Torah, the oral law, the oral instructions were important for their community. It's how they lived out. Take Sabbath, for example. They would teach, this is how we keep Sabbath. God told us to keep Sabbath. He gives us 6 instructions on Sabbath. But what does it mean to make it holy? What does it mean to set it apart? And they would define that orally. But they didn't write it down because it wasn't on the same level as God's Word. But then when all of these other events are happening, they actually write that down. It's called the Mishnah. It's written down. And I only bring that up not to give any credibility or importance to the Mishnah. It's important to us historically because it tells us how they did things in the temple. It tells us a lot of insight to the first century, but it also highlights why they started trying to preserve texts, something that was never written down. There was just oral teachings passed down. They're now writing them down. There was a huge debate over this. The ancient rabbis, they said, we're not supposed to write this stuff down. This isn't the same as the Torah. This isn't the same as the Bible. But they said, we need to write this down so that people later than us will know how things were done in our time. And there's a portion in there where they say, we've all heard it, the fence. They said, we built a fence around the Torah to make sure that we don't break the instructions of God, but the fence is not the Torah itself. They wanted to make sure everybody understood when they read this that this was not the same thing as the Word of God. When you get to 100 CE to 400, we start having a standardization of the scrolls themselves. When beforehand we're writing down on parchment or
papyrus, it may be different lengths. Now we're starting to see really these things have the scrolls and the codices start taking on a standardized form. So the parchment that they're using now is from clean animals only. They're making sure we're not using any leather from any animal unless it's a clean animal. You know, it has a cloven hoof. It's a cow, an ox, or a goat, or goat skin was very common for the scrolls. Even vellum later on, like from antelopes and deer, they're clean animals. They're using them for that. They have columns that are no fewer than 48 and no more than 60 lines. With at least 30 letters each. So this standardization helps them not just to make it look uniform, it helps them copy it better. And all of this is building into our concept of the credibility of our text that we have today, how we can trust that it's what was recognized before. They're taking into account how can we copy this down the best way possible. The pages had to be lined, like I was saying. They had to line the pages a certain way so they would follow. If they knew, if I'm reading and dictating out this text, I would say line 3, whereas used to I'm just going back and forth and trying to write it out. Now, instead of going back and forth, it's being dictated to me. And now, instead of just being dictated to me, now the person dictating, I can say, line 1, this line will have 30 words. And then I start writing it out. And it's just more and more standardization in a meticulous way. It must be black ink. They had to have black ink. Nothing could be written from memory. They had a very strict rule. You could not write from memory. Because when we write from memory, we're missing words, we're skipping lines. The space of a hair, we start seeing spaces now in the 100 to 500 AD. There's space of a hair between consonants and a consonant between sentences. So now you start seeing spaces to help us where we're not saying God is nowhere, we're saying God is now here. Those things start happening between the time period of a few hundred years after Jesus. They could not write the name of God with a newly dipped brush. So it had to be a brush that was already writing. You couldn't dip it and then write the name of God. Because what happens when you use fresh ink? When you use fresh ink, you have a tendency to not write correctly because now it's, I'm not a painter, you're a painter, but if you dip it with a lot of paint and then you start to paint, it can be thicker, and so they wanted to make sure you had already been writing with the ink before you wrote the name of God so that you would be precise with its formation. could not take focus away from writing the name once you started. The name of God was very revered. We know this because of the Ten Commandments. And so once you started writing it, you had to finish writing the name before you diverted your attention to anything else. You had very strict standards for that type of stuff. We'll talk about the name a little bit later and why that's important. Let's see. Later tractate additions. So no obsolete Hebrew or anything other than a square script. So when at this period, they're now using the same script. You didn't have confusion by using different scripts. And why is that important? When you go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, they would actually use the older Paleo script to write the name, or to write the word temple, or to write, when they wanted to make something stand apart in the text, they would use Paleo Hebrew. So it's really interesting. When I was in Philadelphia, I got to see the Dead Sea Scrolls. They brought them by on an exhibit. And this was years ago, 2012. And I remember being so excited because I'm looking at the text, and I didn't know near what I know today in Hebrew, but I'm looking at the text, I'm reading the words I can, and then all of a sudden, bam, here's Yahweh written in Paleo, and I got all excited because I had a friend that was like, what's that? Why is that different? And I could tell them, this is the name of God. They wrote it in older script to try to set it apart. But here, in this time period, now everything has to be the same script. Letters cannot be written in gold. This was something they did also to set apart things. They would write more holier words in gold. The scroll had to be written by lesser people. Scrolls written by lesser people could not be used in the synagogue. So if you weren't like a seasoned scribe, say you're 20 years old and just starting your life as a scribe, they wouldn't take your scroll. They would use it for different purposes, but they wouldn't take your scroll and read it in the synagogues. That would be used by those who had been doing the scribal traditions for a long time. These names could not be erased at all. So when you looked at the scrolls and maybe, even if you wrote it down wrong, that's the point of erasing. If you wrote something down wrong, you couldn't make a correction. If it was El, Ad, which is like the shortened form of Adonai. El is the shortened form of Elohim. Yah, which is the shortened form of Yahweh. You couldn't erase Yahweh itself, Shaddai, Sabaoth, or Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh, which is in Exodus where God first relates who he is to Moses. He says, I am that I am. So those phrases, if you wrote them down wrong or you skipped a line and you accidentally wrote them where they didn't belong, you couldn't erase them. You couldn't try to fix the scroll at that point. You left it there. And we actually see this at times in the manuscripts we have. We'll see it, and there will be a scribal note in the margin that will say, this was done in error. That's why it's on the next line as well. But those things were regarded as holy, those names, the names of God or the titles of God, and they wouldn't erase them. Any questions thus far? That's a lot of information. None? Keep going. So you have the Amoraim. That's a different group of people from 200 to 500 of the Common Era. They were the expositors. They were the ones that would not just translate the text, they would actually teach the text. They were the ones that were not just being scribes, but teachers in the communities. This is the age of the Talmud. This is where now and if you know anything about the Talmud, that's what it was. It was, they would go to great lengths, and sometimes the craziest lengths, to try to explain the Bible. Not giving it credibility, but giving it relevance to explain who these people were. They were not just writing the text of the Bible. They weren't just transmitting scrolls. Now they're over here, and they're now writing down basically their commentary. These are the first Jewish commentaries that we have at this time. You have the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmud. So you had people in Babylon. So think back in our biblical history, and we go back to divided kingdom, right? The Assyrians take the northern tribes. Babylonians take the southern tribes. Well, they get released. God says, I'm going to release you in 70 years, and you can come back to my land, and I'll rebuild my temple. Well, a lot of people stayed in Babylon. This is in the first century. You actually have more Jews that stayed in Babylon that never came back to the land than what you have in the land of Judea. And so you have a group of people in Babylon, a group of people in Israel, and they're both doing the same thing. They're both transmitting scrolls, they're both copying scrolls, but they're also both commenting on the text. They're writing, we have a Babylonian Talmud and a Palestinian Talmud or an Israeli Talmud. This is where you start to see divisions in the text. We don't necessarily have verses and chapters like we do today, but they're starting to separate paragraphs at this time period. Now you're starting to try to really form together the text. Think about where we started tonight with words that have no separation between sentences, and now they're really formulating this biblical text into literature. And you're talking about a few hundred years after Jesus. This is that time period. You're having corrections that are needed in the text. They're actually making comments out into the margins and saying, this was a scribal error. Some scribe in 400 AD is writing a note out here saying, I'm copying from a scroll, but there's a clear mistake. And so when I'm copying, I'm actually fixing the mistake. The scribe would say, I'm fixing the mistake or whatever. We have these scribal notes today. So there's, we'll get to it later, but you can write it down now. It's Biblia, Biblia, Hebraica, Hebraica, Stuttgartensia, Stuttgartensia. So BHS is what it's called. You can put in parentheses BHS. So when we get to the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, we're going to have Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. This is our first what we call a critical Hebrew. It's where they formulated a Hebrew text. I'll bring a copy of it when we get to that part, really, but just to give it to you now. And they would actually, what they're doing is they're not just giving the Hebrew and telling translators, okay, translate the Hebrew. They're bringing the Hebrew text and they're including all the comments and the margins from scribes. They're including comments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're including, at the first one, they didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We hadn't found them yet. But they're including all these margins so a translator can say, okay, well, I came to this and I think it says God is now here, but the scribe said, actually, that's a mistake. It really should be God is nowhere. And then the translator has more tools to work with to make a better decision about how to translate this verse. But it all starts back here in the first few hundred years after Jesus, where scribes at that time started making comments and saying why they were changing something or why they added something. Before that, you didn't have that liberty. You go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you don't really have a lot of comments. Those come later. So very important for us in understanding how we write things down and through the centuries. We got about 10 more minutes. And then now we're going to go to 500 to 1000 AD. 500 to 1000 AD. This is the time of the Mazarites. So we've said the phrase Masoretic texts a few times in the past few weeks. This is the time of the Mazarites. These were the most diligent in copying the text. They all took their job seriously, but these have taken it beyond that. And they were writing meticulous notes. The Mazarites, they're not just writing notes in the margins. They're actually writing volumes. They would write a separate scroll for their notes. There's that many notes in their stuff. They would, they would have the text, notes in the margins, and then you would have an accompanying text for all of their notes. I mean, they're writing a lot of notes here to tell us these were why we translated this way. These are the people who have added the vowel pointings so that later people could understand how it was spoken, at least at their time. And so now they're writing comments about why they pointed things certain ways. Why did they add vowel pointings where it didn't seem necessary? When we look at, there's a scholar by the name of Robinson from Oxford University. He says, everything countable seems to be counted. That's what that was his comment to sum up his notes on the Mazarites. They're the ones that took the counting to the next level. They were the ones that really just honed in on this is how many verses and how many letters we should have, and if you're off from that, you're wrong, or you've missed something along the way. The Islamic conquest in 638 CE forced the Mazarites to move to Tiberias. Now, Tiberias is on the Sea of Galilee, and this becomes like a holy site for Judaism, but even for us. I love Tiberias. I love to go and see all the sites there that have to do with our history of the Bible. Whenever we think of several Jewish scholars, you may have heard of Rambam, Maimonides, famous Jewish commentator from the Middle Ages. He actually moved to Tiberias to write and comment there because it was seen as, he thought it was a more holy place because of these Mazarites that have moved there. He's actually buried there. You can go to his tomb today. He was buried there. They're adding the vowel points. They're adding accents. They have the Masora, which is that extra commenting that they're doing on separate sheets. And they're adding a lot of corrections. They're bringing in a lot of corrections to what used to we would say, we'd have to look at text and say, was this one right or is this one right? They're saying this is what is right based on all of the text that we're seeing. They're becoming really scholarly in how they're passing down the text. There's two families at this time. One's called Ben Asher, and one's called Ben Naphtali. Ben Asher, Ben Naphtali means son of Asher, son of Naphtali. These two families are where we get most of they bring two different manuscripts to the Mazarites. So essentially we have two Masoretic texts. There's 8 very minor differences between the two, and those have to do with word division and vocalization. But there's very little differences between the two. But those are the two families that preserved the text and allowed them to be able to. I have some pictures here that would have been on a slide, but that's Mariah. She's at the tomb of Rambam in Tiberias. It's this big. I found it on accident. It wasn't even. I don't think, Tommy, you didn't even go there, did you? That was. It wasn't even part of our tour when we went. I went for a run and at nighttime, and I saw this huge light in the city of darkness, and I'm like, "What is that?" It was like a beacon, and I went running there and I saw it. So the next night, I brought Mariah and I met a friend who was living in Israel at the time, and we went and saw it. But it was really neat. We got a few more minutes. We'll talk about corrections. So. They used special points. There was 15 points of question in the text. They were, when they would question, they had 15 places that they would say, what's going on here? And when you think about the whole Old Testament, that's very, very small. They had a diamond above a word or phrase. So if you saw a diamond, it was something that was questionable. That was something they were saying, we're not sure about this. Were they words to be deleted? Were they questionable words? That's kind of what they're asking there. They had questions and discussions that happened. They would bring in rabbinic discussions and put them in their notes, and they would give answers to those things in the notes. I'm skipping through a lot of stuff just to keep us moving forward because we're kind of behind here. They would have suspended letters that were above the normal line. They would bring them up. So like in Judges 18:30, the noon in Moses' name would be raised up. Or in Job 38, the ayin is up. We have a lot of these different places where they would bring these letters up. That would pass through all the time. Here's one thing that's very important that we need to understand. There's a thing called Ketiv Kareh. So you can write down as Kethiv. That's one word. And Kareh, Qere. What these two words mean. Ketiv means what is written. Now, if you remember from our division of the Hebrew Old Testament, we would have the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the writings. And that comes from the verb ketiv. And so ketiv is what is written. And then kareh means what is to be read. So this is a very, very common practice, ketiv kareh. Now it's used not just in what we're going to talk about, we're probably very familiar with. It's the name of God. So you would have Yod He Vav He, and that's the name of God, Yahweh, or there's all these questions today about how do we say it. Is it Yahweh? Is it Jehovah? Is it Yahuwah? And those questions that get brought up come from the Hebrew text and these vowel pointings. And what they were doing, it was very well known, they were using a ketiv kareh. They didn't want to even utter the name of God. And so what they would do is they would put the name of God and they would add vowel pointings for two different possibilities. They would either add the vowel pointings for Adonai, or they would add the vowel pointings for Elohim. And so when you got to the name of God, the vowel pointings would say whether they wanted you to say Adonai or Elohim. There's a few places in the Hebrew text where it actually uses Yahweh next to each other. So instead of you saying Adonai, Adonai, or Elohim, Elohim, they didn't want you saying Yahweh, Yahweh. They would actually put the vowel pointings for Adonai first and then the vowel pointings to Elohim next. And so you would read it Adonai, Elohim. And so we know, especially like from that example, we understand what they're doing because of how they're placing them next to each other. And so when we have things like Yehovah, that's actually trying to force a pronunciation into an unpronounceable version of the name Yahweh with the vowel pointings for Elohim underneath it. There's other places where they do this as well. It's not just with the name of God. One of my favorite places is in 1 Samuel chapter 5, I think. It's where the Israelites go to battle against the Philistines, and the Philistines steal the ark away, and then God causes their statue of their God to be broken. It falls down once, they pick it back up, it's shattered, and then all the people get this disease, right? They get this disease on them, and they say, we've got to send this ark back to Israel. This is a curse from their God. This is a curse from Yahweh. And actually, so what do they, I don't know if you remember the story, what do they send back? They send back some golden tumors, right? And so what is a golden tumor? Like, what would that look like? Who knows, right? But actually, when we go back and we look at this Hebrew text, we look at archaeology, we look at other writings, we understand that they had a lot of phallic symbols all over their worship. They would have phallic symbols hanging from their ceilings in their homes. This was part of their worship of their God. And the word there about the disease that came on them was basically a venereal disease. It was a disease that would come on their genitals. But instead of saying the word for that, because it was seen as vulgar, they actually use a kativ kareh to make you say something along the line of tumors. And so we have our translations that say tumors, but when we've done research, we really see that they were trying to add a politeness to the text. They don't want you to say this out loud because it seemed vulgar, but say tumors instead. And so that's a pretty neat little part where it's not just the name of God that they're using this. But when it came to the name of God, it's called a perpetual kareh. This is something that was always used across the board. What is to be read was never what was said. Ancient scripts used early Hebrew for the name. We talked about that. It would use, when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's using the Paleo Script. This is actually another way of using a katif kareh. They would use the block letters. When it got to Yahweh, they would use the older letters, so it reminds you to skip over it, don't say it, or say something else. But by the time we get to the Mazarites, they're actually putting the vowel pointings there to make you say Elohim or Adonai. And I think that's a good place to stop. Let me see. We'll finish up the Mazarites. We got one more here. So they continued to meticulously copy it, their text. And this is what happens until we get to the printing press. The Hebrew Bible was first used in a printing press in 1488. And this is being done, Alcaia, Spain. They were the most meticulous later on after the Mazarites, these Spanish Jews, in writing down. And they actually didn't want to use the printing press. They said, we actually like to still write. And I was trying to think of what we do today. There's times where today even we'll say, no, we don't want to use technology because we honor this old tradition. And I really thought about it, and I listened to what I said last time. And Bible binding, like I love Bibles. I love really good Bibles. And so when I had a Bible mess up, Nate just had one redone. Miss Lee sent it to a guy locally. My first Bible I had rebound. I sent it to California because they were using a very old way of bookbinding. They would sew the pages in. They would take your Bible all apart. Well, now, I could have sent it to this place in Nebraska. They would have used modern technology to fix my Bible. But guess what? It would break and tear apart probably in another 5 years. So what did I do? I sent it to this other person that's using a very old tradition of bookbinding, which is known to be way more reliable today. This is kind of the view of those Spanish Jews and why they continue to write down. So we have 3,000 manuscripts from the 12th century on, where they're really still writing down. Manuscript, remember, means handwritten. From the 12th century on, they're still writing down these manuscripts to the tune of 3,000 of them. There's a person in 525. His name's Jacob ben Chaim, and now he's starting to write down the rabbinic edition. He's starting to print it out now. And so what does that mean? He was actually a Jewish Christian. His name sounds very Jewish because he was Jewish, but he was a Christian. And what he was doing at that point, he's not just writing down notes about scribal errors. He's writing those things down, but now he starts to write commentary down. And he's starting to print that into the text of these scrolls. And so that's where you kind of see a lot of commentary. Today we have study Bibles, on every shelf. Me and Tommy have been talking about a new Bible for him and looking at different options. And there's so many options about study Bibles. This is really kind of your earliest manuscript that's being, no longer a manuscript, it's being printed, and it's using extensive text and commentary within the printing. We see that later on in our English Bibles when we get to like the Geneva Bible. That was one that was really famous for putting their marginal notes and their commentary in the printing itself. It's what really made the King of England mad and really caused the Puritans to leave. So that's where we'll leave it tonight. We have, we're in the middle of Old Testament transmission. We're in the Middle Ages, and we'll pick up there next week. Any questions at all from tonight? Yep.
Well, I don't know if this is for tonight or something you get to later about a jot and tittle.
Jot and tittle. So the jots and tittles would really be, because that's uttered at the time. That's Yeshua, that's Jesus saying those words. So that's in the first century. So a lot of people, they look at our Hebrew text today and they'll say, well, a jot and tittle would refer to the little dot or the little, well, those didn't exist at the time of Jesus. What really it's referring to, in my opinion, and we can't really know exactly, it's not like he didn't comment on what he meant by jots and tittles. We can take some writings of that time period and kind of look, but really what I think he's just meaning is from the smallest letter to the greatest. And you have the yod, which is the smallest letter. And so the jot and the tittles would be like a yod or a vav is what a lot of people think, because it's the small yod and then the long vav. It just means that not one word. It's a poetic way of saying there's nothing that's going to pass from the text. I'm not coming to do anything different here. That's at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, that's Matthew 5. That's a good question. Any other questions? But yeah, that's one of my, when I look at people comment on that, they'll say, well, that's the dot underneath that means E, or that's this and this. We're talking about stuff that's 1,000 years later than when Jesus said that. It's not referring to vowel pointings. It's just saying, it's a poetic way of saying there's nothing that I'm coming to say that's against what you already know is Scripture. All right. No other questions? It's a lot of information. Would it be beneficial if I shared some slides so y'all could go back through it, or?
It'll be whatever you put it, great. You just do whatever.
Well, so I have the slides. I can share those and put a link to those like in our private group, and that way y'all can access the slides and do that or something, or I could email out or something like that. Because it is a lot of information, and really I'm trying to condense like a lot of material that would be, 3 hours a week for 16 weeks and trying to condense it down. I don't want to bog us down forever in this. So,
Does the king think that the commentary would be like added to the Word of God?
No, so we'll get there, but the Geneva Bible, you're talking about my comment on the Geneva Bible? What the Geneva Bible did was, the translation that existed before it was taking things like bishop and elder, and instead of saying, those were just common places of respected authority within a community, those were being made as official places of authority that like this is now, like we could have 17 elders in our church. They would say, I'm trying to think of a way to put it that's understandable. They were saying basically the office of, it was the office of an elder. Now it's become a common understanding of authority in a community to now it's this position of authority over people. And so the Geneva Bible is actually going through and saying, they're putting notes and saying, this is not referring to an office. This is referring to people in a community that fostered growth in the community. You know, they're downplaying this authoritarian view of these different positions that had been in before them. So for the King of England, that was a threat to the Church of England. It was a threat to say, all of these positions where y'all are ruling over us, y'all are telling us we can't have certain translations, or y'all are telling us how to act and believe, y'all are basically cracking a whip on the community of the church. They're saying that person has no authority. That person really shouldn't have any say-so. So that was the threat that was there. They were actually, the notes were kind of disparaging towards the Church of England itself and how they were organizing and treating people within the church. A little different from where we're at with the Hebrew text, but we'll get there with the English versions, hopefully, in the next few weeks. We'll get through. I mean, I still had a lot of slides. I'm trying to get through it quickly without just loading y'all down, and making it too much. So, yep.
Well, it's just, and we know so little from what class we've had in Hebrew, but in just realizing that there wasn't all that, and then just thinking of the first in the beginning, but it was not necessarily in the beginning, could have been in a beginning, or in beginning is all it. I mean, just learning that little bit is like, whoa, there's a lot to do with how you translate it.
That's right. Yeah, and so we just Pat and I had a conversation the other day about the NIV, and so we'll say like things were taken out. That even takes into account something else. Another aspect of translation was earlier manuscripts, like why the NIV doesn't include certain verses. There's about a dozen verses that aren't in the NIV that are in other translations. And the NIV is not the only one. They were just the first. It takes into account manuscript history. So there's two views. Do we take the earliest manuscripts, the ones that are closest to the time of Jesus and when they were written? Do we hold those up higher because they're the earliest? Or do we take the majority of text, and if the majority has the verse, then we include it? Well, the problem with that is when we talk about the majority, you have less translations that are older. The farther along you go through history, now you have thousands of manuscripts because they're being copied more and more. They're being passed out. But are they to be trusted more so than the earliest manuscripts? So the NIV says, I think we should take the earliest manuscripts, and the earliest manuscripts don't have John 3:5 in them. And so they would not include John 3:5 because they would say this wasn't in the original version of John. And the thing about that is, and a lot of people get kind of bent around those, but the thing about it is none of those verses take away from the message of the gospel, and none of them degrade anything about the gospel message yet.
Well, we've just been through a lot of series with Dr. Misler.
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah.
And I can't repeat it all.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't write it down, should have, but when he talked about these, and I think, not positive, that NIV was one of them, that there were some agnostics
Mm-hmm.
that came in and did translations.
Yeah, and so there, but you have a series of checks and balances. So there were very few. That was like 2 on a translation committee of like 100. But
I think there was, he just named 2, but I
yeah.
think NIV might have been, and I'm not positive of that.
Yeah, but you're talking about 2 people on a translation committee of 100, and so what they were brought in for was not. They would have some type of expertise in some aspect of the language. They're not really affecting what the final product is in a way that we would expect. And so what you have, like, and we'll look at it with like the King James Version. They were the first to really do, because before King James, you really had single, John Wycliffe is translating the Bible, William Tyndale's translating the Bible just themselves. King James now has committees. He assigned so many people for each portion, but that committee would come together and they would translate it, but that didn't mean that their translation was accepted on that. Now they had editors that would take their translation and actually go through and say, well, I don't think this should have been translated. And they had checks and balances. And so today we actually have more extensively checks and balances when it comes to our translations. So most of our translations, I'm really not for translations if it's only one or two people translating the whole Bible. I don't agree with that because I want that checks and balances there, So that's kind of what's going on there. Good comments and questions. Anything else?
One last question.
Yeah.
What in the world are you writing on to write the whole Bible?
Oh, so I can actually share it with you. So I think it was Crossway is just a Bible publisher. They actually make what's called an interleaved Bible. What that means is every other page is a blank page. So when you open it up, this side is the Bible in the ESV, this side's blank. So I'm literally just copying over from this side to this side. Very tiny, yeah. So I can share with you the pens I use too. So they're micro tip pens, 0.005 micro pens. To be able to make sure that I'm meticulously copying over. So, but yeah, interleaved. I can share the link if you want it. It's really cool. It's the one I got. It's like bound in leather, and it's got it's an old looking Bible. But when you open it, every page that you turn to has the ESV translation on one side with a blank page on the other. And people use it for different things. They use it for notes. It's not really. They make it not for what I'm doing, but for people to write their notes out on a whole page. But I'm just using it as a way to copy over. So, yeah, I'll show it to you. Anything else? All right, thank you. I appreciate y'all.